March 9, 2024. Burke County, North Carolina. The shovel rang like a bell, a bright metallic note that didn't belong to the forest. And Ranger, Elise Granger, froze on the slumped edge of Burnt Hollow Trail. Last week's storm had chewed a muddy scar across the ridge, so she was cutting a new runoff trench, pushing red clay and wet leaves with the dull end of her Pulaski. The mountain was quiet in that particular blue ridgeway. No traffic, no chainsaws, just wind moving through white pines and the far hiss of a creek. She cleared the debris with her boot, wiped rain grit from her gloves, and brushed at the spot where the sound had come from. Not natural stone, too smooth. Her fingers found the lip of something set by a human hand. Mortared brick, scorched dark, fitted in a rectangle the size of a cellar hatch with a rusted iron ring embedded off-center. The cabin site locals called Devil's Elbow lay 30 yards downslope, a blackened rectangle of char and collapsed chimney that had been a rumor before it was a ghost. Elise had walked past these ruins 100 times on patrol, noting how the fire had stayed inside the footprint like a locked room. Now the ridge itself was telling her the room had a basement. She forced a breath calm and steady, slipped the radio from her shoulder, and keyed the mic. Dispatch, Granger at Burnt Hollow, Spur 3. Possible subsurface structure, sealed. Requesting sheriff's office and fire marshal. Static, then Marla from the Jonas Ridge Tower. Copy, Granger. Sheriff Lane is en route. Do not enter. Elise stared at the ring. Do not enter was the right order. She looked up at the sky anyway, the kind of thin March blue that never warms. Told herself 30 seconds wouldn't count as entering. She slid the Pulaski's pick under the ring, leveraged slow, felt the bond give like a stiff jar lid, and lifted the slab a hand's width. Air exhaled from the mountain, cold, dry, iron-tanged, the ghost of old smoke. She angled her headlamp into the gap. Cut stone walls. A ladder rung hammered into mortar. On a shelf of rock sat a black steel case the size of a bread loaf, edges intact, paint barely blistered. Fireproof, military style. She lowered the slab like she was putting a sleeping child back in bed and backed away, heart kicking against her ribs with a rhythm she remembered from when she was 9 and lost for 40 minutes in Linville Gorge, feeling that the mountain was listening back. 10 minutes later, she heard boots in leaf litter and the soft clack of a pelican case. Sheriff Rebecca Lane came out of the trees with an evidence tech in tow, gray braid tucked into a ball cap, coat open despite the cold. You're the one who woke my phone, Lane said, voice all gravel and drawl. Show me what shouldn't be here. Elise led them across the ash pan of the ruined cabin, the chimney leaning like a tired tooth. Up close, the burn pattern looked wrong in a way only clean crime scenes look wrong. Walls charred to lace, flooring gone to powder, but the pines around the perimeter barely singed. Lane crouched at the hatch, traced the mortar with one gloved finger, and shot a look up at mixed approval with warning. Not on any survey, she said. We'll do this by the book. The tech laid plastic, set tripods, shot frames. Lane worked a pry bar gently, a surgeon peeling bone from bone. The slab lifted. The cold rose. Elise felt it in her teeth. My ridge, my mess, Lane said, then nodded at Elise. But you found it. You want the ladder, or do you want the flashlight? Elise swallowed. I'll take the ladder. She descended 3 rungs into a square room, no wider than a pickup bed. The beam found a rusted lantern on a nail, a crate of exploded mason jars, a scatter of mouse-chewed paper, and the black case sitting like a word nobody had said out loud since 1986. The latches were stiff, but willing. The lid creaked. Inside lay a tight stack of items protected from heat and time. A spiral notebook with edges rippled by pressure, a Polaroid face down, a folded county map, a small blue hair barrette blistered by heat, and wedged in a corner a cassette in a cracked shell with a name scrawled in blocky pencil. LUCY July 12. Elise's breath hitched. She flipped the Polaroid. A man with a sunburned face and a mustache sat on a stone porch with a barefooted girl curled against his side, her smile chipped by a fresh gap where a tooth had been. The back of the photo was labeled in the same hand as the tape, Burnt Hollow, Saturday. Lane dropped into the hole beside her, beam steady, jaw tight. "Don't read ahead," Lane said gently, eyeing the notebook like it was radioactive. "Bag what we can see and take a breath." But Elise couldn't help it. The notebook's first page had bled pencil through the paper, as if the writer had pressed too hard. "If you're reading this, we didn't make it out. My name is Jim Halbrook. My daughter is Lucy. We were followed. I've sealed us in the cellar under the cabin. Please tell my wife I tried." Elise shut the cover like it could bite. The tech reached down a sleeve, and Lane slid the notebook in, then the Polaroid, then the tape, then the barrette. Each sealed the way you put away a body. "Truck was found up the bend," Lane said quietly as if the mountain might overhear. "No keys, no struggle. A pink windbreaker on the seat." July 86. Search went on 3 days until a thunderstorm washed every track off this ridge. We told ourselves the fire took them. She aimed her light at the unscorched box. "Seems the fire didn't take everything." Elise climbed out shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold. Above ground, wind worried the crime scene tape they'd strung between saplings. The site read like a diagram to anyone who could read sign. A rug shadow where floorboards burned clean. A melted arc on hearthstone where a plastic handle must have rested. Pea gravel scattered in a way that looked like it had spilled from a can. She flagged the arc and took a photo. It meant a gas and sat there long enough to print itself into stone. Lane's phone buzzed. She listened, eyes on the tree line, then pocketed it. Janice Halbrook goes by Margaret, now is on her way with her sister. I told her we found personal effects. I didn't say which. Elise thought of a woman carrying 38, winters and summers without an ending, and felt heat climb her neck. She glanced at the taped cassette in the evidence tray and fought the urge to break chain of custody and listen for a child's voice that had been stuck in plastic longer than Elise had been a ranger. 2 hours later, tires crunched at the pull-off, and 2 women climbed the slope slow like the ground might not hold. Lane met them first. Names were given. Hands were held. Elise stood back, suddenly aware of her boot prints everywhere. The mountain had kept this quiet for nearly 4 decades, and now it would set its secret down at the feet of the person least able to carry it. Lane showed the Polaroid in its sleeve. Margaret's hands rose to her mouth and stayed there. "That's her," she said after a long breath. "That's my girl. She'd just lost that tooth." Jim made a joke about the tooth fairy needing a map to find us. She didn't cry then. She stared at the chimney, then at the iron ring, like the landscape itself was a document she was learning to read. Lane explained what they could: a sealed cellar, a protected box, a notebook in Jim's hand. Margaret nodded once like a verdict had been delivered. "He was a planner," she said. "He wouldn't have left nothing for later, unless later was the only thing he had." The evidence tech, voice careful, held out another bag, the warped blue barrette with tiny stamped stars. "Do you recognize this?" Margaret's fingers twitched, and then she folded them together hard. "Lucy called that color grown-up blue," she said. She bought it with her allowance so she could look like a softball player. The words shook, loose whatever she'd been holding, and she cried then, shoulders small, under a coat that had seen too many springs. Dusk came early up there. Frost glazed the ruts. Lane sent the sisters back to the ranger station to warm up, sign what needed signing, drink bad coffee under good heat. Elise stayed to guard the hole and watched the light pull up out of the timber like a tide. She pictured a man in 1986 crouched just below the trees, watching the same rectangle glow, deciding what story the county would be allowed to tell. She looked down at her mud-black boots and made herself a quiet promise that tasted like iron. The mountain had tried to keep them safe. She would keep their names loud. Behind her, the wind lifted and laid the tape and lifted it again, so the sight seemed to breathe. The ridge had exhaled once and given up a door. Now it waited for someone to choose which way the next door would open. March 9th, 2024. Night had already swallowed the ridge by the time. Sheriff Lane locked the evidence in her cruiser and led everyone down to the ranger station, a squat cinder block box that smelled like wet wool, coffee, and pine cleaner. The fluorescent lights hummed, the heater clicked, and Margaret, who once had been Janice, sat at the conference table with her sister and kept one hand on the sealed bag containing the blue barrette, like it could drift away if she let go, while Elise stood at the far end of the room, flipping through a blank intake form she'd already filled out, twice because her hands wanted something to do. The spiral notebook lay in an evidence tray, the cassette in another, the Polaroid in a third, and Lane said, calm and even. That chain of custody mattered, and they would do this right. And then she surprised everyone by pushing the tray with the notebook toward Margaret and saying, you decide if we open it here. And Margaret nodded once, not dramatic, just a tired yes shaped by 38 years of not knowing. Gloves snapped, the plastic scene hissed, and the notebook opened with a dry crack. The first page carried the words Elise had already seen in the cellar. If you're reading this, we didn't make it out. My name is Jim Halbrook. My daughter is Lucy. And then more lines written in a heavy, burning pencil hand that carved through to the page beneath. We were followed on the gravel cut past Morgan Bridge. He stood at the tree line at dusk. He did not speak. I locked the door. I found a trap under the hearth that wasn't on the plans. We have water, but not enough. If the smoke comes, we'll wet the towels. If someone finds this, tell my wife I tried to keep our girl quiet and brave. The next pages were dated like entries July 12, 1986. Heard one knock on the door, not a voice, just one. July 13th, 1986. Tracks around the ash, size bigger than mine. Cigarette butt near the stump. Brand Viceroy. July 14th, 1986. Smoke came, slow at first, then fast. We sealed the gaps. I think we can make it to morning. It read like a man writing with his body, between his daughter and the world. And by the time Lane closed the cover, the room had gone quiet in the way rooms do when everyone is holding their breath. We'll copy and bag every page, Lane said, and Margaret Eyes red but clear whispered. He always overprepared. That was his way of saying I love you. And Elise stared at the cassette like it might start playing by itself. We need a lab, the evidence tech said, and Elise was already texting Boone, the wildlife audio lab where Dr. Brennan Kessler baked owls' field tapes and pulled words from wind. 90 minutes later, they were in a windowless bunker of a building that hummed like an aquarium. Brennan, in a denim shirt, frowning at the warped plastic, explaining in a voice that made hard things sound simple, how old tapes get gently heated to reset the binder, how you don't force anything, how time can be convinced to let go if you ask it the right way. They waited in a corridor under a poster of a whip poor will, while the machine clicked in a sealed cabinet, then filed into a small booth where Brennan set a laptop on a foam mat and handed over 2 pairs of headphones. This is the best transfer you'll get, he said, and Elise, Lane, and Margaret leaned in as the screen pulsed with a flat gray waveform, and the first sound rolled out static like rain on a tin roof. Then a child breathing too close to the mic, then a whisper in a small, brave voice. My name is Lucy Halbrook. I'm 9. Dad says talk quiet. We're in the little room under the cabin, and there's a man outside with something metal. We heard him scrape it on the door. Daddy says we're making a fort. I don't like the dark, but I'm brave." There was a soft bump, a muffled baritone Jim saying easy. Kiddo and the girl again. "Mommy, if you hear me, I didn't cry. I kept the lunchbox shut. I saved the good crackers." A click and silence. Margaret had both hands on the table, and her knuckles had gone white. But she didn't break. She inhaled and exhaled like a runner and said, "That's her sleepy voice." She always did that when she was trying not to wake me. And Lane wiped at her eye and pretended it was dust. Brennan burned 3 copies to gold discs, printed a chain label, and slid the master file to an evidence thumb drive. "That voice is dated July 12, 1986, he said, pointing at a faint control tone on the tape. "Your man wrote the same day in the notebook. You can sync them within an hour." And Elise felt the case straighten from an old ghost story into a line of time stones. Back at the station, Lane called the state crime lab to set the notebook for latent prints and chemical fume processing. But she also pushed a photocopy of the second entry across to Elise and tapped the word Viceroy. "Not many folks smoked that brand here in the 80s, she said, and Deputy Ortiz, who had been quiet all night, piped up that his uncle owned a mom and pop in Morgan back then, and still had boxes of old charge slips and vendor books. Like a dragon sitting on paper," he joked. So Lane sent a dig, and Elise asked for the original incident photos from '86, the ones that had been digitized badly and mislabeled worse. And in a beige county computer room, they scrolled through smoky frames of the cabin, the truck, the chimney, the melted arc she had seen on the stone, and one bright rectangle that didn't match. A grainy gas station, still with a man in aviators and a short-sleeved button-up lifting a red can. Time-stamped the morning Jim and Lucy drove up. There was nothing you could prove from it, but the still sat wrong, his posture too still, his line of sight not on the pump, but on something beyond it. So Lane printed it and wrote beneath it in blue pen, same day. "We'll need motel records, vendor logs, pawn slips, anything that catches names," Lane said. And Elise, who knew these hills like a biography, mapped the ridge roads on a clear sleeve and started circling pull-offs where a watcher could sit with a clean view of the cabin without leaving tracks. And there were 3, not many, which made the world feel smaller and colder. Past midnight, after Margaret and her sister had gone to a motel with 2 deputies parked outside and the tech had ferried the notebook to the lab, Elise stood alone in the gear bay under a buzzing light, replaying Lucy's whisper over and over on a county laptop with cheap speakers. She wrote the timeline on a whiteboard in block letters. July 12th, note plus tape. July 13th, tracks plus cigarette. July 14th, fire. July 15th, unknown. Next to it, she wrote 2 questions without answers. Why the clean burn, and why no bodies? The mountain had offered a 3rd question with its secret cellar. If they survived the fire, who decided what happened next? At 2:11 a.m. Ortiz texted a photo of an old ledger column stained with coffee. Viceroy cartons delivered July 10th, 1986 to Red Pines Motor Lodge and to a Hilltop General Store that had closed in '92. Red Pines still has a manager, Lane said when Elise showed her the text. His father ran it back then. He's a hoarder of ledgers, and they decided to knock at dawn. Elise tried to nap in the chair, but her brain ran trails. Back to the hatch, the iron ring, the cold breath rising, the black case that had waited 38 winters for a hand brave or foolish enough to lift it. And she realized the thing that had felt off since they set eyes on the cellar. The lockbox had 0 heat damage. Yes, because it was fireproof, but also because whoever put it there had known it must outlive the flames. That simple fact meant intent. Someone had known the fire was coming and had time to choose what would survive it. At 5:47 a.m., coffee in hand and fog low over the fields. They drove the 2-lane down to Red Pines, its neon vacancy sign half-lit and flickering, and the manager Trip Tyner, 60-something with a nicotine mustache and an amused frown, led them to a back room lined with file cabinets, pulled a ledger from 1986, and set it down, its pages sun-warped and oily. Lane flipped to July, found the 13th, and stopped at a scrawl in block letters. James Kell, room 6, paid cash, no plate. Tripp chuckled, said his dad always joked that anyone using a psycho killer alias was asking not to be remembered, and Lane's eyes went flat. She tore a carbon slip from the back, dusted a corner with the old in-house powder kit Tripp kept for nostalgia, and a smudge of a partial whirl lifted under tape like a ghost raising its hand. "We'll see if 40 years can still talk," Lane said. Back at the county lab, the scanner hummed. The AFI's terminal blinked, and the match came back a few minutes later to a name Elise didn't recognize, but Lane did an old rumor turned record. Victor Gain Tillman, born 1949, suspected in a string of disappearances across 3 states, never convicted, last seen the summer of '86. Elise felt a cold slide down her back. Not fear exactly, but the realization that the shape in the trees wasn't just a bad man. It was a man who had learned how to take and keep. Lane tapped the screen. "We don't have proof he took Jim and Lucy," she said, steady as ever. "But he was on our highway, in our motel, buying our smokes, the same week our cabin burned, and Elise, who had found a door in the ground and opened it, stared at the print swirl and thought, the mountain kept the story safe. The story is about to stop keeping him safe." When they finally stepped back outside, dawn was a pink bruise over the eastern ridge, the pines black against it, and Elise caught herself listening for a small voice carried by cold air mommy. "I didn't cry," then put the headphone memory away and climbed into the cruiser as Lane turned the car toward the hills. Chapter 2 of the case had started in ink and tape, and now it ran on gas and asphalt toward the places where men like Tillman liked to vanish: cheap rooms, back roads, edges of maps, while a blue beret in an evidence bag caught a line of sunlight on the seat and flashed like a beacon. July 14, 1986, Blue Ridge Mountains, North Carolina. The sun had just started climbing above the ridgeline when Sheriff Alan Boyd leaned against his cruiser and studied the pickup abandoned on the shoulder. A red 1978 Ford F-150. Mud spatters crusted on the wheel wells, the hood still streaked with dew. It sat like someone had left it in a hurry, crooked, one front tire sunk into a rut. The passenger window was halfway down, a child-sized pink windbreaker visible on the back seat. The bed held a cooler, lid latched, the kind of thing a family would pack for sandwiches, drinks, and marshmallows by a fire. Except there had been a fire, downslope, 30 yards through the trees. Black smoke still curled faint from the skeletal remains of a hunting cabin. The roof was gone. Beams reached skyward like bones, and the chimney leaned as if ready to fall. Boyd tugged his hat lower against the heat that was still rising from the ashes. His deputy, Marie Latimer, crouched by the driver's door scribbling in her notebook. "Plates match," she said. Janice Halbrook filed her missing persons report at 10 this morning. Husband Jim, daughter Lucia. Left Saturday morning, supposed to be home last night. Boyd rubbed his jaw, squinting through the tree line at the ruin. "And now we've got a truck with no keys, no bags, and no people." Marie's eyes flicked to the pink jacket. 9-year-old girl. Doesn't sit right. The two descended the embankment, boots sliding in pine needles slick with dew. Cicadas screamed in the pines overhead, a constant metallic whine. As they neared the ruins, the air thickened, rank with the bitter aftertaste of scorched wood and something darker burnt fabric, maybe, or worse. The cabin was a carcass, stone foundation, Scattered tin cans melted into lumps. Fragments of plastic warped into unrecognizable shapes. Fire looks contained, Marie murmured. She pointed at the perimeter, where ferns and leaf litter were untouched. Didn't spread to the trees. Almost surgical. Boyd nodded grimly. Somebody wanted this place burned, not the forest. They stepped carefully across collapsed beams, boots crunching on charcoal. The chimney rose over them like a marker. Near the hearth, a dark patch stained the ground, sunken and clotted. Marie crouched, nudged a melted zipper with her pen. Next to it, half hidden in ash, was a child's shoe rubber toe warped, laces half gone. She lifted it gently with the pen tip. Size small. Girls. Maybe Lucia's. Boyd's jaw tightened. He scanned the clearing, forcing his mind to catalog details instead of dwell on what the shoe implied. Melted thermos. Charred scraps of denim. A warped lunchbox. Plastic edges bubbled, rainbow stickers curling. He crouched and brushed away soot with gloved fingers. The metal clasp had survived, faintly visible. Inside, the remnants of foil and paper. Packed food, he muttered. They barely got started. Marie rose, voice quiet. And no bodies. They circled the cabin, searching. Boyd noted the burn pattern. Flames hottest near the fireplace, moving outward, but with edges too clean, too controlled. It looked staged, not like wildfire chaos. He looked again at the shoe in Marie's hand. If they'd been inside, we'd find bone. Heat like this doesn't erase everything. Marie's gaze swept the woods. So either they weren't here when it burned, or somebody wanted us to think they were. By mid-afternoon, forensics arrived. Technicians in Tyvek combed through ash with sieves, bagging fragments. K-9 units looped the clearing, noses to the ground. One dog barked and strained northward, following a faint trail, but it vanished 30 yards away where the soil bore faint tire ruts. The trail ended in churned dirt, no tracks leading further. Boyd stood with a fire investigator near the chimney. The marshal pointed with his probe. Burn origin inside the hearth. No accelerant residue. Whoever said it, they built it hot and clean. Could have been to destroy something or cover it up. The sheriff glanced at the evidence bags being sealed, the shoe, the lunchbox, fragments of charred clothing. He thought of Janice Halbrook waiting for a call, of the sandwiches still in her fridge, untouched. That evening, back in Austin, Janice stood at her sink, hands gripping porcelain, staring into the yard. Her sister Beth sat at the kitchen table, slowly turning pages of Lucia's coloring book. "They're just late," Beth said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You know Jim. He loses track of time." Janice's gaze didn't move from the swing set outside, its chains still, the seat empty. He promised they'd be back by dinner. Her voice was flat, hollow. Lucia's shoes are still on the porch. When the phone rang, Janice's hands slipped from the counter. She knew before she answered that silence had ended. Sheriff Boyd's voice was heavy. He didn't give details, just that her husband's truck had been found, and she needed to come down to the county office. July 14th blurred into night. At the scene, deputies taped off the clearing. Floodlights cast harsh cones over ash and stone. Marie returned from the perimeter, clipboard in hand. "We found something else," she told Boyd. She held out a cigarette pack. Viceroy brand, half-crushed, soot-smudged, but recent. Not Jim's. He didn't smoke. Not according to Janice. Boyd turned the pack in his gloved hands. No prints visible, but it didn't belong near. Another presence did. He looked at the blackened shell of the cabin, the controlled fire, the missing family. "Somebody was with them," he said. "Somebody who wanted us to believe the fire ended it." Above them, crows circled, black silhouettes against the darkening sky. The next morning, the forensics report came in. No bone fragments, no trace of human remains in the ash. No bodies, just belongings. Evidence of presence without proof of fate. Boyd stared at the report until the words blurred. Lucy's shoes sat in its bag on the desk, rubber warped, small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. He thought of the trail of tire tracks vanishing into nothing, of the cigarette pack, of the shoe that suggested a child had been here until the fire consumed everything but her absence. He thought of the silence of the mountain dot, and he wondered, for the first time, if the fire had been less a tragedy than a curtain. A way to hide whatever came next. Outside, dawn lifted over Burke County. The mountains stood in shadow, keeping their secrets. Somewhere between ash and silence, his story had been buried. Boyd knew they'd only scraped the surface. The official report would call it undetermined cause of fire. But Boyd, Marie, and the few who stood in that clearing knew better. Something or someone had walked away, and the mountain, patient and quiet, would wait nearly 4 decades before letting anyone else find the rest. By sunrise the next day, frost clung to the ditch grass outside Red Pine's motor lodge, and the neon vacancy sign blinked like a tired eye. Sheriff Rebecca Lane signed the visitor log more out of habit than necessity, and followed the manager Trip Tyner, nicotine mustache, ball cap, a kind of cheerful fatalism, through a narrow office stacked with old ledgers. "My daddy wrote everything down," he said, tugging a July 1986 book free and thumping it on the table. Never trusted computers. Lane pulled on gloves and flipped pages that smelled like coffee and sun-warped plastic until she reached July 11th to 15th. There it was, written in block letters, a name that wasn't a name. James KELLRM6 CASH nitrogen monoxide plate. You ever meet him? Elise asked from behind Lane's shoulder. Tripp shrugged. I was a kid. Dad joked any fella using a killer's alias didn't want to be remembered. Lane tore a carbon slip where a right thumb had pressed too hard and, on a whim, dusted the corner with the motel's ancient black powder kit. A partial ridge appeared like something surfacing from deep water. 2 hours later, at the county lab, the scanner hummed, the database chewed, and AFIS spit back a match with a bureaucratic beep that felt like thunder. Victor Dane Tillman, born 1949, electrician by trade, wilderness guide by hustle, multiple detentions and no convictions, suspected in assaults and disappearances from Kentucky to Missouri. Last confirmed sighting August 86 Tennessee line. Status: presumed dead, no body recovered. Lane stared at the glow of the monitor and then at the ledger page inside its evidence sleeve. Not dead enough, she said flat. Elise felt a prickle move across her scalp, the same sensation she'd had the minute the cellar. Exhaled something old and patient, shifting in the dark. They drove straight to the Ranger, station where Margaret, who had been. Janice waited with her sister Doris and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Elise set the Polaroid on the table first, then the notebook copies, then, after asking for permission in the softest way she knew, plugged in the lab's little speaker and hit play on the digitized file Brennan had transferred. Lucia's voice filled the room, thin and brave, talking about the little room under the cabin, about saving the good crackers, about not wanting her mother to cry. Margaret didn't make a sound until the girl's whisper caught on the word Mommy. Then she cupped both hands over her mouth and nodded at nothing, as if reaching agreement with a memory. Lane explained the motel ledger, the fingerprint, the name Tillman. Doris asked the question Margaret couldn't. If he stayed here, and the fire was the next day, does that mean he was already watching them? Lane didn't offer more than the truth they had. We can place him on this highway that weekend. We can place a Viceroy carton here. We can place a man with a red gas can at a Morgan pump the morning Jim and Lucy drove up. What we can't do yet is prove he reached their door. Elise slid a clear sleeve across the table, A simple county road map coated with circles and arrows pull-offs with sightlines to the cabin. Timber breaks where you could sit in a car and watch without leaving a single footprint. "There are 3, she said. "The ridge shoulder here, the old fire line here, and this third one, a logging spur folks abandoned after the flood in '82. Lane nodded and turned to Deputy Ortiz, who had just come in smelling like gas station coffee and dust. He slapped a photocopy of a vendor sheet down Viceroy deliveries with a finger on 2 lines. "Red Pines and a hilltop general store called Wessler's. Store burned down in '93, Ortiz said. Owner's widow kept the books in her basement. Bless hoarders. Lane dispatched him again, this time to pull any credit rolls, any visitor logs, any unsigned receipts that might put Tillman within 10 miles of the mountain more than once. While deputies worked the paper, Elise chased the dirt. The old incident photos from '86 had been captured with a county camera that loved to blur and hated low light. But she found something in a frame of the hearth, a melted arc etched into stone. She and the fire marshal returned to the site, kneeled where the heat had been fiercest. "Plastic handle sat here long enough to print," the marshal murmured. "Gas can, not proof." But a rhythm was forming. Red can at the pump, arc on the stone, clean burn that respected the timberline. A cellar sealed before the match was struck. A fireproof box waiting like a message dedicated to the future. Intent layered on intent. Back at the station, Lane's whiteboard grew branches. Timeline on the left, July 12th note plus tape. July 13th tracks plus cigarette. July 14th fire. July 15th? Names on the right. Jim, Lucy, Tillman, unknown. Unknown bothered Elise like a pebble in a boot. In Brennan's enhanced scan of Jim's film roll recovered from an envelope, Margaret had found in a desk one late frame showed Lucy on a boulder, beaming, her legs dusty, and in the seam of trees behind her, a vertical sliver of a man who didn't belong to the family's day. You couldn't see a face, but posture tells stories. He stood too straight for a hiker, too still for a hunter. When Elise laid the sliver beside the gas station still aviators, neutral stance, attention somewhere beyond it, felt like looking at a shadow cast by a moving object. "We're missing someone," she said out loud without meaning to, and Lane, who didn't like guesses, still gave the smallest nod, as if allowing a door to crack. "Rumor from back then," she said. One clerk in Avery County said Tillman checked in once with a younger man, claimed him as a nephew, paid in coins, bought rope and batteries. Report got buried when the case went cold. Unknown, Elise wrote in dry erase ink, underlining it twice dot by late afternoon. Ortiz called from a defunct title office with news that made Lane's jaw set. A parcel deep in Pisgah had been tax paid through the '60s and '70s by a D. Tillman trustee, and by nobody, then by cash purchased money orders in '84 and '85. The parcel pinned to a spur ridge no one cut through anymore, the kind of place loggers abandoned and poachers loved. Lane traced the coordinate with her finger and looked at Elise. "We're going to need boots, a drone, and a warrant," she said. Elise, who had spent the last 5 years patching trails in that same country, heard her heartbeat step up. "And daylight," she added. "We do not guess our way into that timber at dark." They left Margaret and Doris with a victim advocate and a clear plan. The lab would prioritize prints on the notebook. The state would fast-track DNA on the barrette against an old hair sample from Lucy's school folder. Brennan would run the cassette through one more pass to capture faint background, sound that might be mechanical or a distant creak. "If there's a hum, I can notch it," he'd said. Frequency maps can lie, but sometimes they tell you what kind of machine was nearby. Margaret touched Elise's sleeve before she left. "If my daughter breathed mountain air after that night," she said, voice thin and fierce at once, "if she saw another sunrise, I need to know how many." I need to know who put her back down. Dawn found them at the trailhead to the spur ridge marked on Ortiz's parcel map. Fog lay in the low spots like spilled milk. Lane had 2 deputies with long guns for snakes and men, and a small drone zipped ahead, whispering its figure 8 between poplars. Elise moved in front with a topo map folded small and a ranger's habit of reading slope with her saws. It wasn't far as the crow flies, but on foot the ridges ran like teeth. They left the path after 8 minutes and followed an old skitter scar, choked now with laurel and greenbrier. A mile in, the drone's feed showed a rectangular roofline under leaf litter, a roof that had half collapsed inward, a chimney that still had its cap. There, Lane said, though everyone could see it, and Elise felt heat rise despite the cold. The clearing was only a clearing, because the structure had killed whatever tried to grow beneath it. The front steps slumped. The door hung open an inch, wood swollen with seasons. There was a generator carcass off to the side, rusted down to a nest for mice. Lane held up a hand and listened. The woods offered nothing but wind. They stepped as if the floor might have a memory. Inside, the smell arrived first not rot, not fresh, but a dry iron note of old blood baked into wood and years of air gone stale. 2 rooms, one big, one small, both stripped to function. A table, a pair of 5-gallon buckets, a cot frame with its mattress long hauled away by animals or men. At the back of the larger room, a door with a hasp, scarred from opening and closing 1,000 times, the wood around it burnished by palms. The lock had been cut once, then replaced, and cut again, layers of habit. Lane's crowbar pried like a sigh. The hasp gave. Elise shouldered the door. Cold breath from within. The small room had no window. Soundproofing foam pocked the walls under plywood, some squares falling away to reveal adhesive scars. A child's drawing was thumbtacked crooked above a narrow pallet. Trees, a cabin, 2 stick figures holding hands. One tall, one small. The tall figure had no eyes. On the floor by the pallet sat a lunchbox with a rainbow band, the clasp tarnished but working. Elise touched the lid like she might wake something. Inside, a half-finished friendship bracelet, clumsy knots in blue and white. A stub of pink crayon. A folded photo of a little girl with her hair in pigtails. The name Lucy printed in block letters on the back in a child's own hand. Lane's breath sounded loud. "Bag it," she said, but soft, like a prayer. They worked the place slow, like you would work a scene under a river. Food wrappers dated 1988 lay flattened under a table leg. A corner of a magazine with a Nashville dateline. A nail scratch tallied in groups of 5 along the lowest board, the height of a child kneeling. In the main room, Elise crouched where the floorboards looked newer and tapped. Hollow, the crowbar went in. Under the boards, a shallow cavity lined with rock, empty now, but stamped with the print of something that had once weighed a lot and lain a long time. Lane didn't speak the thought. She didn't have to. You don't build a hidden cavity for blankets. They backed out in a line, marked the door, sealed the rooms, flagged the path in, left the rest to forensics. At the trailhead, with the drone tucked and the warrant copies signed, Lane looked over the pines toward a ridge that had held a secret for 38 winters and said, "This doesn't end in this county." Elise, clutching the clear sleeve with the drawing and the lunchbox photo, thought of Margaret's hands on a coffee mug that had gone cold hours ago. She thought of Lucy's whisper, saved in plastic against flame, of a man who taught himself how to leave no footprints, and a ledger that kept one anyway. Somewhere, she believed, the unknown stood in a hallway of his own making and felt the wind change, the way it does before a storm. The mountain had given up its first answer. The next would be harder. But they had a name that wasn't a rumor, a room that wasn't a myth, and a child's drawing that did not lie. The day after the cabin in Pisgah, the case shifted from dirt and timber to paper and faces. In Lane's office, the lunchbox photo and the crayon drawing sat under a desk lamp, while the state lab, called to say the barrette, carried a partial mitochondrial profile consistent with a sample Margaret had kept for decades, a single strand taped into the corner of a second-grade art project, good enough to say likely Lucy's, not good enough to end it. Elise watched Margaret trace the outline of the stick-figure child with a gloved fingertip and say, in a voice that made the air in the room feel thin, she drew herself smaller so he would look bigger. And Lane, who didn't show much, looked away and cleared her throat and said there was one more lead, a quiet one that had sat in the back of a state database since 1994, like a ship in fog. A woman left at the E.E. Morgan with no ID, underweight, dehydrated, silent. The hospital listed her as Jane. The county placed her at Briar Glen Adult Care, 2 towns over, and she'd stayed, year after year, compliant and closed, a face in a window that no one visited. It went that afternoon, rain needling the windshield, the care facility low and practical, under a row of tired maples. A nurse in scrubs met them in the hall with the clipped kindness of someone who's done this long enough to be both skeptical and hopeful, led them past puzzle tables and an aquarium buzzing under a sheet of algae, and stopped at a door labeled 12A. "She look at you," the nurse said. "She won't answer. Don't crowd her." Inside, the woman sat in a cardigan 2 sizes too big, hair shoulder length with threads of gray, posture folded in on itself like a paper crane caught in a draft, eyes on a jigsaw whose edges didn't quite fit. Elise set a folder on the table and spoke in that ranger tone meant for skittish animals and lost children. "I brought some pictures." No reaction at first. She slid the first plastic sleeve out, a Polaroid of a girl with gap-toothed joy, barefoot on a stone porch, a lunchbox at her hip. The woman's eyes flinched as if a draft had found her. Elise set down the second, the drawing from the soundproof room, 2 figures holding hands, the tall one eyeless. The woman's hand floated up, hovered, then traced the little stick head with 1 finger, barely touching the laminate. Elise took a breath and set down the third, the age-progressed rendering of what Lucy might look like at 46. The woman blinked hard, lifted her palm to her own cheek, like she was matching angles, and nodded once, tiny but definite, as if granting permission for the world to catch up. Lane stepped to the doorway to give the room space and wiped under one eye like she was chasing a stray eyelash. Elise said, "We recovered a tape." The woman's hands clenched. Elise placed the little digital recorder on the table and pressed play, and Lucy's whisper drifted out, grave and small, talking about the little room and the man outside with something metal and saving the good crackers so her mom wouldn't be mad. The woman began to cry without a sound, shoulders shaking, hands flat on the table, as if to keep herself from floating away. When it ended, she reached into the pocket of the cardigan and pulled out something she had carried for years, a thin silver chain with a flattened gold ring threaded through, and set it in Elise's palm. "Jim's," Elise breathed, because she had seen the inscription on the watch in the old family album. JMH, love always. Ammon L. Lane arranged the DNA swab with the soft force of a warrant you didn't want to have to use. The nurse nodded. The lab courier drove like a funeral. And by evening, a scientist's voice on speakerphone said the thing everyone in the room had already accepted with their eyes and their hands. Jane Glenn's profile matched the Halbrook line. Margaret was on her feet before Lane finished the sentence, driving down with Doris through rain that blurred headlights, walking into a small room that smelled of starch and lemon cleaner, and stopping 3 steps in when the woman in the cardigan turned her head. There was no movie-sized embrace, no monologue, just a sound like a held breath released after 38 winters, and Margaret whispering, "Lucy, baby," and Lucy nodding, and both of their hands finding the other and holding on like rope. When Lane left them, Elise sat in her car and stared at the dashboard and let the rain drum until it sounded like static again, the way it had on the tape. And then her phone buzzed Deputy Ortiz with a photo from an auction surveyor out of Ironvale, Tennessee. A brown 1978 Oldsmobile Vista Cruiser sunk to its axles behind a falling livestock barn. Plates gone, then visible through dust, registered once upon a time to a Tillman alias and never seen by any DMV since. They were on the road at first light, coffee and granola bars, and the hard quiet that comes when the thing you've been chasing might have left a skin behind. The farm was a tangle of briars and rust, the wagon swallowed half by dirt, windows clouded, dashboard cracked like old paint. The forensics team worked the doors with inflatable wedges and patience, and the car side open on a den of mice and paper. Glove box fat with maps and motel matchbooks. Passenger footwell littered with receipts too faded to read. Rear bench sagging under the weight of years. Elise eased aside a folded wool blanket, blue with white stars, and saw the corner of a flannel shirt gone brown with old blood. Under it, unbelievably, a Nikon Fie with a roll still inside. The lab in Boone moved fast chem bath, slow dry. Cool light, and an hour later, a ribbon of small glossy windows told a story in frames. The wagon on a ridge at dusk. A shed with a stovepipe. A long road lined in sycamore. A photo of a porch Elise didn't recognize with a little girl sitting on the step, hair in pigtails, face solemn, like someone had told her to hold still. Then a frame taken with flash in a dark room, blown out and crooked. A man in a chair, wrists bound with wire, face bruised, eyes open and furious in a way that told Elise he hadn't given them silence for free. Someone had pushed the shutter to prove to himself that he owned the moment. The time stamp on the print had survived ghost-like along the sprocket edge. AUG 0486, 2 weeks after the fire that was supposed to make the world stop looking. Margaret saw the print at her kitchen table with Doris' hand on her shoulder, and she did something no one expected. She smiled through tears, small and wild, and said, "He was breathing, like a victory, like proof that the man she married had been exactly who he said he was to the last breath he could bargain." Lane sent the shirt for serology and got back an answer that made everyone go still. The blood was Jim's, degraded but clear. He kept him alive, Lane said quietly in the evidence room later. The photo under glass, the lunchbox beside it, the drawing above it all, like a banner. For weeks. For what? Elise asked, though she could guess. Lane stared at the wall where the whiteboard carried a new column. Places burnt hollow cellar, Pisgah room, Ironvale wagon, and drew a circle around an X on a topo copied from one of the glove box maps. A spur in the Smokies circled in red pencil with no road in or out. Because some men don't want anything but time, Lane said. They hiked in the next morning with a small search team, drone shrilling ahead, air cold and glassy, slope steep enough to force the heart to keep track. The shack in the trees looked like all the others' patched roof, leaning chimney, door sagging, but the smell at the threshold was iron and old rain. And when Elise tapped the floor and found a hollow thud and pried up a neat square of plank to reveal a shallow stone box filled with earth that packed like brown sugar and bone that showed the shape of a skull with one side crushed. Lane didn't speak for a minute. She just slid a hand under the dirt and lifted the watch they all hoped they wouldn't find. The inscription had almost vanished under rust, but when Elise tilted it, the light caught the ghost of letters. JMH. Love always M&L back at Burke County. The dentist who had once cleaned Jim's teeth for a church raffle matched the molar patterns by afternoon. Cause of death, blunt force trauma, instrument consistent with a fire poker found leaning in the corner of the shack. Lane typed the notification to Margaret and then drove it herself, because some news should not travel by wire. Margaret opened the door, and Elise, who had promised herself not to cry in uniform, failed and cried anyway, while Margaret did not right then, not until she had placed the watch on the table beside the ring and the lunchbox photo and said, in the voice of a woman who has reached the end of one road and sees another forming like a mirage, "He kept our girl alive long enough for someone, maybe him, to put her where she could be found." Later, and Doris said what everyone else had been afraid to articulate. Then there was another person to drive her there. That night, Lane and Elise spread the glove box maps out on the squad room floor, traced the red pencil circle in the Smokies with a clear ruler, and followed a dotted line a hand had added to the margin, an old fire road, to a trail, to a creek, to a place where the paper had worn thin from being folded and unfolded. Unknown, Elise wrote again at the bottom of the board, not as a void this time, but as a target. The mountain had returned a daughter and a husband. It still owed them a name. By March 21st, the case was no longer just about a cabin fire in 1986. It was about a man who had managed to vanish into the cracks of Appalachia, and the possibility that he hadn't acted alone. Sheriff Lane's board at the Burke County office had grown teeth, timelines across the top, evidence photos taped in rows Lucia's drawing, the cassette tape, the rainbow lunchbox, the Nikon photo of Jim, bound and bruised, and beneath them, in red marker, 2 names. Victor Dane Tillman, unknown. That second word was underlined 3 times. Elise had slept in her truck the night before, unable to leave the station after staring too long at the enhanced image from Jim's last roll of film. Lucy on a boulder, smile faltering, and a figure half hidden in the trees. Not Tillman, the posture was wrong. Younger, leaner, but someone standing still enough to be caught without meaning to. Lane brought in the state's behavioral unit that morning. A profiler named Carver, with gray stubble and the kind of calm that made every word sound carved from stone. He paced in front of the board, hands behind his back. Tillman was meticulous, he said. A man like that doesn't bring a stranger into his operation. If someone else was present, it's because they were tethered family, blood, or disciple. You don't share this kind of secret unless you trust them not to breathe it. He tapped the unknown label. This is your loose thread. Pull it hard. They started with Tillman's past. Ortiz dug through county birth and death records, prison intake logs, even Army draft cards. One name surfaced more than once. A cousin, 10 years younger, drifting between Ohio and Tennessee, last official trace in 1985, when he signed for a post office box under the name Vincent Dale. No confirmed sightings after. Elise felt the room tighten, as if the air itself had leaned closer. Meanwhile, Brennan and Boone called with news from the tape. He had stripped the static layer by layer, filtered the hums. There's a frequency underneath, he said. 60 hertz. Not natural. That's an electrical hum. And there's a faint tick every 20 seconds, like a generator misfiring. Lane frowned. Which means, Brennan answered, wherever that child recorded, there was power. Not the cabin, not the cellar. Somewhere wired. That detail changed everything. The root cellar had been dark, silent. But the cassette told them Lucy had, at least for part of her captivity, been somewhere else, somewhere built for confinement. 2 days later, they got the break. A surveyor in Tennessee stumbled onto an old shack marked on one of Tillman's deed maps, tucked into the Smokies where the road was little more than a scar in the slope. Lane and Elise took a team out, boots crunching frost, drone circling overhead. The shack sagged, half-eaten by moss, chimney leaning like a gravestone. Inside it was stripped, just a table, 2 buckets, chains bolted to studs. But Elise's eye caught something in the back room. Plywood over foam, crayon drawings pinned with nails, children's sketches, animals, stars, a crooked cabin. One drawing showed a man and a child holding hands. The man's face was blank. On a pallet lay the rainbow lunchbox, faded but intact. Inside, a bracelet half finished, knots clumsy but determined, a stub of pink crayon, a folded photograph of Lucy herself, with the name written on the back in her own hand. Elise held it like it might dissolve in her palm. Lane's voice dropped to a whisper. She was here. Food wrappers in the corner carried date codes from 1988. Lucy had survived at least 2 years, past the fire. And then, beneath a loose board in the main room, they found the stone-lined cavity. Empty now, but too carefully built to be nothing. A place to keep someone or something. A smell of old iron still clung to the air. Forensics logged it all, sealed the site, carried the lunchbox out like an artifact. That night, Lane briefed Margaret in the ranger station. The mother sat clutching Lucy's drawing with trembling hands. She lived, Lane said. She lived for years. Margaret closed her eyes, lips moving in a prayer no one could hear. Doris sat beside her, hand locked tight around her sister's wrist. Elise, unable to stop herself, said, if she lived, someone made sure she stayed hidden. That someone might still be alive. In Ironvale, Tennessee, deputies combed the farm where the Vista cruiser had been found. In the glove box maps, they traced one spot circled in red. Lane tapped it with her pen. That's where he went next. Elise felt it in her bones. Tillman was not the kind of man who stopped. The unknown was not a ghost, but a partner, maybe younger, maybe waiting back in the care facility. Jane Glenn now confirmed as Lucia sat by her window, cardigan pulled close, a photo album on her lap. She hadn't spoken, not yet, but when Elise placed the crayon drawing in front of her, the woman's fingers trembled over the stick figure child. A tear slid down her cheek. Elise leaned close. You survived. You're safe now. But we need your help to finish this. The storm was only beginning. They had proof of Tillman, proof of Lucy's survival, proof Jim had been held alive weeks after the fire. But now, with the shack uncovered and the lunchbox bagged, they had to face the most dangerous truth of all. Victor Dane Tillman might not have been alone, and the second man, the one in the photograph, the one Lucy had drawn faceless, could still be out there, carrying the silence of nearly 40 years like a weapon. And as Elise drove back through the mountains, headlights slicing fog, she couldn't shake the thought. The mountain gives up secrets slowly, and sometimes it doesn't give them up at all until someone decides to take them. March 22, 2024, the Great Smoky Mountains, Tennessee. The trail they followed wasn't on any modern map. It wound upward through thickets of rhododendron and slick-mossed stone, nothing but deer paths stitched into the ridge. Sheriff Rebecca Lane led the way, her GPS pinging against the hand-drawn coordinates they'd pulled from the Vista cruiser's glove box. Elise Granger trudged close behind, sweat prickling beneath her ranger jacket despite the cold. The higher they climbed, the quieter the world became. Birds fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. When the trees finally broke open, they saw it, a sagging shack perched in a clearing like a scar no forest wanted to reclaim. Its roof had caved in on one side, chimney cracked, door hanging from one rusted hinge. The place radiated unease, a kind of stillness that made both women hesitate before stepping forward. Inside, the air was metallic and bitter. The stink of old rust and something deeper iron seeped into wood. Elise swept her flashlight across the room. Chains bolted into studs, a table scored with knife marks, a rotted cot frame without mattress. In one corner, floorboards looked newer, mismatched with the rest. Elise knelt, heart hammering, and pried them up with her crowbar. Beneath lay a shallow stone cavity packed with dirt and bone. The skeleton was partial, but unmistakably human. A wristwatch, corroded but intact, still clung to one joint. Lane brushed it clean. On the back plate, faint but legible, was the inscription: JMH, love always. M and L. Elise closed her eyes. Jim Halbrook, she whispered. He hadn't vanished in the fire. He had been taken here, kept, and killed. Forensics later confirmed blunt force trauma to the skull, likely with the iron poker found leaning near the fireplace dot. When they told Margaret, she didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She sat at her kitchen table in Austin, Jim's watch set gently beside the wedding ring she'd kept on a chain for decades, and said in a voice cracked but steady, "He bought us time. Long enough to hide her, long enough to keep her alive." Doris reached across, squeezing her hand. Elise realized then that Margaret wasn't speaking in metaphor. She believed Jim had placed Lucia somewhere Tillman couldn't immediately reach. Back at Burke County, Lane spread the maps across the squad room floor. Dozens of dots, scribbled notes, faint penciled trails. But one circle glared red a remote valley Tillman had marked again and again. If Tillman had help, Lane said, tapping the circle, this is where they went next. Carver, the profiler, studied the patterns. He didn't work alone, he said flatly. Everything about this screams redundancy. 2 sets of eyes, 2 sets of hands. That's why Lucy lived longer than she should have. He wasn't just hiding her, he was teaching someone how to keep her. Elise's stomach turned. A disciple. A younger man, perhaps blood, perhaps bound by something darker. The faceless figure Lucy had drawn, the shadow in the photograph, Jim had unknowingly captured. It all snapped into place. They made camp near the ridge that night, search team bedding down under tarps, while rain rattled the branches. Elise couldn't sleep. She sat staring into the coals of their fire, thinking about Lucy Now Jane, sitting wordless in her care facility room, clutching her stuffed rabbit, tracing her own childhood drawings. Somewhere inside her was the memory of that second man. Somewhere, locked deep, was a name. Elise whispered into the dark, "We'll find him. I promise." The next morning, deputies called from Ironvale. They'd finished processing the Vista cruiser. Tucked into the driver's seat lining was an envelope labeled in block letters. Keep for SAFE. Inside were 4 Polaroids. 3 showed Lucy at different ages 10, maybe 11 thin, weary-eyed, clutching her lunchbox. The 4th showed the cabin at Burnt Hollow, taken days before the fire. In the second-story window stood a man. Not Jim, not Tillman. Younger, leaner, face partially obscured by glare. Elise felt her pulse spike. The second man hadn't just existed. He'd been inside the cabin before the fire. Lane's jaw tightened. Witness reports from 1986 mentioned a hitchhiker with Tillman. Clerk at a gas station thought he was family. Paid in coins, bought rope and batteries. We wrote it off. She tapped the Polaroid. We don't write it off now. Meanwhile, in the Briar Glen facility, Lucy turned a page in the photo album Margaret had brought. Her hand trembled as she stopped at a picture of Jim holding her on his shoulders. Tears slipped down her cheeks silently. Then she reached into her cardigan pocket and drew out a chain with a ring Jim's wedding band, flattened, worn smooth. She placed it in Elise's hand. Elise stared at it, throat thick. "You never forgot him," she whispered. Lucy didn't nod, didn't speak, but her eyes told the truth. That night, Elise couldn't shake the thought of the Polaroid figure in the cabin window. Younger, lean, nameless. If he had been 20 then, he would be nearly 60 now. Still alive. Still out there. And if Tillman had taught him, then Lucy's captivity had been longer, stranger, and more dangerous than anyone had dared imagine. The mountains held their silence, but Elise knew. They were closing in. One man was dead in the dirt beneath the shack. The other was alive. The faceless figure Lucy had drawn nearly 4 decades earlier was about to step into the light, and when he did, everything they thought they knew about what happened in July 1986 would change. March 24, 2024. The rain broke just after dawn, a thin gray sheet tearing open above Burke County, and Elise drove straight from the ranger station to Briar Glen with a cassette copy in her pocket and a plan she didn't entirely believe in. Lucy Jane sat by the window with the stuffed rabbit in her lap, cardigan sleeves pulled over her hands. Margaret had spent the night in a guest room 2 doors down, waking every hour to stand in the hall and listen for breathing the way mothers do. Elise pulled a chair close and set a small portable speaker on the table. "I want to try something," she said, voice low, "the way you speak to deer and children who've had too many reasons not to trust. Only if you're okay." Lucy looked at the speaker without moving. Elise pressed play and let the tape run, but not the words. She had Brennan's filtered track that emphasized the faint electrical hum beneath the whisper. 60 hertz, a little wobble every 20 seconds. She watched Lucy's eyes. Nothing at first, then a flinch, like a reflex. Elise looped the hum and added a second sound Brennan had isolated from the hiss, a soft clink that repeated irregularly. "Generator," Brennan had said on the phone, and something metallic on a chain. Not wind, not human habit. Lucy's gaze drifted to the corner. Her fingers tightened on the rabbit's ear. She lifted her left hand slowly and traced a small circle in the air, then tapped her thumb twice against her index finger. Circle. 2 taps. Elise leaned in. A switch? A lock? A clock? Lucy blinked hard, frustration mounting behind her eyes. She scraped her nail across the wood of the table. 3 short scratches and then 1 long. Elise stopped the speaker. "Okay," she whispered. "You're doing great." 3 short, 1 long. Lucy put her hands flat, breathing fast, then reached for the scrapbook Margaret had built and turned to the page with the lunchbox photo from the shack. She touched the clasp with 2 fingers. 2 taps again. Then she touched the edge of the drawing from the Pisgah room where the tall figure had no eyes and pressed her fingers hard into the paper as if erasing. Elise felt the hair rise on her arms. "He turned something," she said quietly. 2 clicks. Then the lights. Or the door. Lucy closed her eyes and nodded once. Lane called as Elise walked into the hall. "We got a partial from the Motel Ledger Prince Ridge that wasn't Tillman's," she said. "Old Kip, bad lift, but it's not his." And Ortiz found something else: post office box receipts out of Kingsport, purchased in cash in '86 and '87 under the name Vincent Thale. That was one of the cousins' aliases. 2 signatures on a change of address form. One matches Tillman, the other's younger, sloppier. Elise stared at the floor, fighting a wave of anger that had nowhere to go. "So the second man had paper," she said. "And he stayed after the fire." Lane exhaled. "If he delivered Lucy to Briar Glen in '94, there'll be something security footage, an old nurse's memory, a maintenance log about a broken tail light people don't vanish without leaving friction. Meet me at Mercy General in an hour." The hospital had replaced its cameras 3 times since 1994, but basements remember what they're asked to forget. A records clerk with a ferret's eye for dead media rolled out a dented cart with 4 labeled banker boxes. Intake logs, CCTV tapes, security incident reports, maintenance tickets. Lane and Elise set up in a windowless conference room that smelled like dry paper and old toner. In the e-ledger for September 10, 1994, an entry jumped. Female, approx 18 to 22, no ID, nonverbal, left at door. Jane. The margins carried a note in a nurse's cursive. Found with wool blanket and small chain around wrist. Cut by maintenance. Elise went cold. Chain, she said, thinking of the soft clink in the tape's background. The security report from that night described a brown station wagon idling at the loading lane for less than a minute. A figure in a cap walking a young woman by the elbow to the door and then sprinting back to the car. Tape pulled, the guard had written. Overwritten after 30 days. But hospitals are museums of accident. In a maintenance folder, Elise found a yellow carbon copy. 10/8/94. Cut handcuff from intake patient. Tool loan from engineering. Returned. A name scrawled at the bottom. R. Paris. Paris was retired, living in a trailer park behind a feed store 10 miles south. He answered the door in denim and nicotine and laughed when Lan flashed the badge. I thought I'd die before anyone asked me about that night again, he said, then sobered. She was small, quiet like the quiet that means you've been told to be. Bruise on her temple, old scar on her forearm. Chain wasn't police, it was hardware store junk. I cut it and gave the nurse a look that said, "Do you want me to call somebody?" She didn't say no. She didn't say yes. We were all younger and dumber back then. He rubbed his jaw. The guy who dropped her walked like a kid trying to be a man. Big jacket. Hat pulled down. I remember thinking his hands didn't look like a mechanic's. Too clean. Back at the station, Carver took all of it and built a person out of crumbs. A young man carrying out a task he was trained to see as an errand, not a crime, he said. He doesn't touch her like a lover or a brother. He touches her like inventory. He wears a hat because he doesn't want his hair caught on camera. He runs because he's terrified and proud. He's not trying to disappear totally. He comes back to the same counties under new names. He buys rope and batteries with coins because the older man tells him that's how you keep the bank out of your business. He tapped the Polaroid of the man in the burnt hollow window. He was inside before the fire. That means he knew the house. He knew the door that led to the cellar. He may have been the one to find it. Elise went back to Lucy with a new plan, not to push for words, but to put objects in her hands. The barrette, the lunchbox clasp, a plastic light switch from the hardware store, a cheap padlock, the rabbit. Lucy reacted to the switch first, fingers moving into muscle memory. 2 clicks, hesitation, then a third like she couldn't stop herself. Elise tried the padlock next. Lucy took it, turned it, then stopped and shook her head hard, a flicker of panic crossing her face. She pressed the lock into Elise's hand and pushed it away. "Okay," Elise whispered. "Okay." She replaced it with the rabbit. Lucy pulled it close and rocked once. Margaret stood in the doorway, gripping the frame, tears bright and unshed. He told her if she turned the 3rd time, it meant no, she said suddenly, voice gone hoarse. Elise and Margaret both froze. When she was little, Jim made up a game so she'd never go with a stranger, Margaret said, words spilling like stones. 2 taps for yes, 3 for no. It was silly. We thought it was silly. What if she kept it? Elise felt the floor shift under the day. Then the 3rd click saved her. She said Ortiz burst into Lane's office at dusk with a folder he held like it was on fire. Found it in a DMV back bin in Avery County, he said, out of breath. An administrative note from 1988 handwritten request to reissue a license to a Victor D. Tillman with an attached photo that isn't Tillman. He slid a faded ID across the desk. The man in the picture was mid-20s, clean-shaven, thin mouth, eyes that seemed to avoid the lens even while looking straight into it. The clerk had scrawled relative next to the application, then crossed it out and stamped denied. A sticky note was still adhered, almost fossilized. Came back angry. Older man apologized for him. Lane felt the same old anger flare. She looked at the stamped date, March 2nd, 1988, a year before the date code on the food wrappers in the shack. He was there with Tillman, she said. He wanted papers. Tillman ran the charm while the kid ran the temper. She flipped the photo over. A half-torn address sticker clung to the back. RL ST Kings RT TN Kingsport. Elise texted Brennan. Cross-check maintenance receipts, pawn slips, anything in Kingsport in '88 with a fake Dale, Dell, or Kel. Brennan didn't have police tools, but he had friends and a grant that let him pay for old microfilm. By midnight, he called back. There's a hardware store chain in Kingsport that ran a no-questions policy back in the day, he said. Bought with cash, no names. But sometimes, cashiers wrote descriptors anyway, when it was sketchy. August 1988, 2 men, one older, one young, bought padlock case, chain 30 feet, foam panels, plywood, battery lanterns. Clerk wrote, younger with light hair scar on forearm. Elise closed her eyes. Paris's offhand memory about an old scar. The hospital note. The tape's metallic clink. The foam on the walls. The chain. We're building him, she whispered, piece by piece. Morning brought a call from the state lab. The mitochondrial profile on the blue beret matched the hair from Lucy's old art project at a threshold. Lane could take to court. Margaret cried when Lane told her, then laughed, then cried again. She called that color grown-up blue, she said, and Elise, who had learned to let details hit when they hit, stepped outside and let the cold bite her face. Back inside, Lane drew a map thread from Burnt, Hollow to Red Pines to Kingsport to Ironvale to the Smoky Shack, and pinned the DMV denial at Avery County on the line. He moved with Tillman, she said. He learned. He delivered Lucy to the hospital the year he turned 20-something. And then he vanished. Carver nodded slowly. He didn't vanish. He stabilized. He built a life small enough to hide a big sin. He tapped the DMV photo. We find that face older by 36 years under a new name, a new job, maybe cleaner teeth, and we find the rest of the story. Elise drove one more time to Briar Glen with a card she'd had Brennan print. The faintest, cleanest version of the DMV photo. Age progressed by a state artist overnight into a weathered man with grayer hair and a heavier jaw. She didn't show it to Lucy at first. She set it face down and asked for the 2 clicks. Lucy gave them. Elise flipped the photo. Lucy looked, and for a heartbeat, nothing changed. Then her hand shot out and flattened hard on the paper. Not a caress, but a pin, like trapping a moth. Her breath went sharp. She pressed her finger to the corner of the photo, where the man's jacket collar showed a tiny embroidered logo. 2 triangles interlocked, and she made a shape in the air with her hand. A triangle. Another triangle. Then she closed her fingers into a fist and pulled down, a gesture Elise recognized, only because she'd spent a career watching contractors work trail gates. Hardware, Elise breathed. Chain link emblem. A fence company. Lucy nodded once. Within an hour, Lane had Ortiz, calling every fence installer within 100 miles that had ever used an interlocked triangle logo. One had Tri-Point Fencing Kingsport, established 1993, family-owned, no job too small. Their current website showed a crew of 4 in blue jackets with the very same emblem. At the bottom of the page, a staff photo. A man in his late 50s with a mouth that didn't smile even when his lips tried, eyes that avoided the lens by a degree, jaw set too tight. The caption read, Rick Parsons, Field Supervisor. Lane didn't speak for a second. Then she exhaled like someone had been pressing on her ribs. Get me a warrant for employment records, payroll, vehicles, she said. and call the U.S. attorney. If he crossed a state line with a child, this is federal. Elise didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She drove to Briar Glen and knelt by Lucy's chair and said, "We think we know his name now." Lucy stared through Elise, then toward the window where late sun flashed through the maples like a broken signal. She lifted her hand and tapped the table twice, yes, and then a third time, no. And Elise understood that assent and refusal could live in the same body at once. "We'll do it right," Elise said. No surprises. At dusk, on the other side of the state line, a man in a small garage swept the concrete and listened to the radio-read news he'd never expected to hear in his lifetime. Authorities identify woman missing since 1986 alive in North Carolina. Investigation into accomplices ongoing. He turned up the volume until the announcer's voice blurred into a single long tone and set his broom aside. On a pegboard above his bench, an old padlock hung between two coils of chain. He touched it once, then wiped his hand on a rag like he'd picked up grease that wasn't there. He looked at the truck parked outside, a battered work pickup with a logo of 2 triangles on the door, and then he shut off the light. The garage went black. For the first time in decades, he felt cold in summer. March 26, 2024. They don't hit the door first. They build the box. Lane loops in the U.S. attorney. A federal kidnap warrant starts its slow, exacting climb. And meanwhile, Elise and Ortiz run a quiet circle around the name on the Tri-Point Fencing website. Rick Parsons. Payroll shows a hire in 1993. A gap before that where references list day labor, carpentry, electrical helper. DMV pulls an old safety citation. 2001. Kingsport. Tan pickup with mismatched tailgate. Driver described mid-30s. Light scar left forearm. Hospital maintenance man Paris had mentioned the scar. Tri-Point job logs show a fence install behind Mercy General the week before. September 10th, 1994. North Service Gate, after-hours deliveries. Ortiz stares at the photocopy, whistles low. He knew the lanes, he says. In Avery County's back stacks, a clerk finds a rejected 1988 license application with a photo that aged up becomes the face on Tri-Point's staff page. A sticky note fossilized to the back reads, "Came back angry." Older man apologized for him. Lane pins it between Burnt Hollow and Kingsport on the board like a stitch. Carver, the profiler, draws the rest. He's a taut man, he says. Learned moves. Copies habits. That's why Lucy never gave him eyes in the drawing. He took his cues from someone else and never looked straight at her. They begin. Surveillance the way you watch a skittish animal patient. Low from the edges. Rick Parsons leaves his duplex at 6:07. Coffee in a styrofoam cup. Drives the Tri-Point truck with the interlocked triangles. Works a chain-link job at a school. Eats ham from a lunch bag alone. Smokes nothing. Buys a six-pack after work. Runs a broom over a garage floor that doesn't need it. He clicks light switches twice without thinking. He locks and unlocks the same padlock twice before he closes the garage. He keeps to the lanes he knows. Elise watches from a borrowed sedan and feels the sick, steady beat of recognition, the ritualized calm of a man who once needed the world to line up perfectly to keep a secret. Lane builds probable, cost brick by brick. Employment logs place him at Mercy. DMV denial links him to Tillman. The photo from Jim's roll shows a younger man in the cabin window. A forensic artist overlays bone structure from the DMV photo on the Polaroid silhouette, lands within likelihood. A Kingsport hardware store microfilm note from 1988 mentions a younger buyer with a forearm scar purchasing foam. Chain, padlocks, items now visible in the shack photos. The U.S. attorney nods. A magistrate signs. The plan lands quiet and heavy across the squad table. 0500, Knock and announce with marshals. Seize electronics. Seize any media. Seize anything with chain, foam, or locks. Elise asks for one deviation. Let me be there when he sees her face, she says. Lane holds the look, measures risk and mercy, nods once. The neighborhood is still blue when the team moves in. Marshals take the back. Lane and Elise take the front with 2 deputies. Parsons opens at the second knock, eyes narrowed, jaw that doesn't know how to soften. Lane reads the warrant, voice flat. He raises his hands, fingers stained with fence paint, and says nothing. Inside, the living room is clean to compulsion. The garage is cleaner. A pegboard with tools ordered by Silhouette, 2 coils of chain, an old padlock polished like a souvenir, a plastic tote labeled camping, holding a battery lantern with a wobble in its hum. Elise feels her throat close. In a shoebox under rags, they find a stack of Polaroids. Woods, roads, a porch that is not burnt hollow, but feels like it then, 2 frames that stop the room. Lucy at maybe 11, hair longer, thinner now, standing beside a fence with a lunchbox hugged against her ribs, eyes searching past the camera. Bag it, Lane says, and her voice isn't steady either. They sit him at the kitchen table, recorder on, Carver in the doorway, a quiet wait. Lane starts easy, routine. Name, job, employment. He gives the present tense facts. When she says Victor Dane Tillman, his mouth pulls at one corner almost imperceptibly, like a muscle remembering a habit. Don't know him, he says. Lane slides the DMV denial across, taps the sticky note. Older man apologized for you. Who apologized for you, Rick? No answer. She sets the Kingsport hardware microfilm print beside it. Who bought the chain? He shrugs. Elise lays down the tri-point job log for Mercy General, the week before Lucy was left there. Who walked a girl to a door and ran? His eyes flick to the page and away again, pupils edging left like prey, calculating distance. Carver doesn't move. He speaks like he's naming the weather. You were a student, he says. You learned the rhyme, the rules. 2 clicks yes, 3 clicks no. You clicked things to keep your hands steady. He taught you to be faceless. But you did one thing he didn't teach you. Parsons breathes through his nose, shallow. Carver nods toward Elise. You brought her to a hospital. The silence that follows isn't empty. It has shape, weight, memory. Parsons' left hand twitches toward his forearm, and for an instant, the sleeve rides up. The scar is there, pale and small, a dropped stitch on skin. Lane leaves the room long enough to retrieve a tablet. On it, the tri-point staff photo fills the screen. She sets the tablet down, then places a second image beside it, an age-progressed version of the DMV face. We can argue names, she says softly, but faces tend not to argue back. He looks at neither. Lawyer, he says, first word with heat. Lane nods. You'll get one. Marshals move him. The house exhales. In the garage, Elise stands under the humming light and lets her eyes adjust to the memory of a shack with foam on the walls and a lunchbox on a pallet. She looks at a workbench and sees a generation of choices lined up in red-handled pliers and sorted screws. She hates how ordinary it all looks. The forensic team finds a storage unit key in a coffee can. The unit 2 miles away holds the rest of the quiet. A folded map with pencil circles matching Jim's. A battery lantern that ticks every 20 seconds. A cassette deck with its belts rotted. A notebook in a younger hand than Jim's, with 6 pages torn out and an imprint left when someone pressed too hard. The lab lifts the impressed writing with an electrostatic. The words rise like ghosts. 2 taps, lights. 3 taps, stop. Don't look. Don't speak. Don't cry. Elise stares at the page until the edges blur. Back at Briar Glen, she sits across from Lucy with Margaret beside her and tries to shape the day into something that can be heard. "We found him," she says. "We found the man who took you to the hospital." Lucy's fingers find the rabbit's ear and pinch tight. Elise turns her palm up. Lucy lays her hand in it, and Elise taps twice. Lucy taps twice back yes, and then a third time no, and Elise understands. Yes, it's him. No, he was not the only one. Lane is already moving to build the bigger box. Conspiracy across state lines. Felony murder for Jim. Aiding and abetting kidnapping. The U.S. attorney smells a case that will outlive headlines. Carver sketches a map of pressure points. Rick Parsons doesn't fear prison. He fears being remembered. Offer him the only truth he's proud of, Carver says. He thinks he saved her. Let him say it, then show him where the saving ends and the taking begins. That evening, in a federal interview room, Elise sits across from him because Lane thinks he might answer a ranger where he won't answer a badge. She sets one photo on the table. Lucy at 11, clutching a lunchbox by a fence under a sky, the exact hard blue of a Carolina winter. "You took this," she says. He stares at the cinder block. "You picked the hospital because the gate was open and you knew the cameras looped," she continues. "You timed the walk to a gap. You told her to keep her eyes down and not to speak. 2 taps for yes, 3 taps for no. Did you teach her that, or did she teach you?" His jaw works once, twice. "I brought her where someone would feed her," he says finally, voice like gravel, poured slow. "And you kept her how long before that?" Elise asks. "Where?" He says nothing. "Who else was with you in the cabin window?" His eyes cut to the corner, where there is nothing. Elise keeps her voice level. "He's dead. You're not. This is the only part that doesn't make you a ghost." He swallows. The recorder ticks. Down the hall, Lane watches through glass, unblinking. In a quiet room miles away, Lucy turns another page in the album and taps twice, then 3 times. And Margaret holds both of her hands so the rhythm doesn't turn into air. Outside, the mountains sit the way they have always sat, patient, withholding, listening to the small animals of the valley make their cases against silence. The 9th day ends not with a confession, but with a hinge. Something in the locked story has shifted. Tomorrow, it will give, or it will hold and force them to pry again. Either way, the box around Rick Parsons is almost closed, and the space inside it, where a second face still waits without eyes, has run out of places to hide. March 28, 2024. The storm rolled in over Burke County just before dawn, thunder folding the mountains into a single low growl, and it felt to Elise like the weather itself was waiting for a verdict. Rick Parsons sat in a federal cell 2 states away, lips sealed, hands folded, a man who had learned long ago that silence can be its own kind of power. Yet silence was cracking now, because evidence no longer asked for his permission to speak. The Polaroids from his garage showed Lucy older than anyone believed she had survived, alive at least into the early 1990s. The lantern hum from the cassette matched the model found in his storage unit. The notebook imprint with rules written too carefully to be coincidence tied him not only to Tillman, but to a system of control. They had both practiced. And then came the final break. Fingerprints on one of the Polaroids matched his Tri-Point employment records. He had been there, holding the camera, watching her through glass and chain link, capturing proof of a girl who should have been gone, but WASN, single quotes T. Lane, knew what that meant. He can deny words, she said to Elise in her office, but he can't erase touch. His hands are on her life. The U.S. attorney filed charges before noon: federal kidnapping, unlawful confinement, felony murder in connection with Jim Halbrook's death. Carver leaned on the psychological edge. Men like Parsons only survive because they believe their story is hidden. Strip that away, they collapse. Show him that we know his rituals, his switches, his two-tap code, and you force him to see himself in a mirror for the first time. Still, no one expected confession. They expected only a trial, but fate isn't bound by procedure. At Briar Glen, Lucy held Elise's hand and pressed 2 taps, then 3, then stopped, eyes fixed on the window with a storm dragged light into darkness. Elise understood. Yes, she remembered him. No, she wasn't finished telling. Margaret sat across the room, clutching the rabbit, whispering prayers that never seemed to end. For the first time in decades, she believed her daughter might live long enough to see justice handed back to her. That afternoon, deputies searched a storage locker Parsons had rented under another alias. Inside was a box of old cassette tapes, most warped or silent, but one still hissed with faint sound. Brennan processed it overnight. What emerged was not Lucy's voice, but a man's Tillman's, muttering half instructions, half sermons, telling someone younger when to watch, when to wait, when to strike matches. And in the background, Parsons's voice answered once, "Yes, sir." That single phrase tied him to Tillman, not as partner, but as student. He learned cruelty, Carver said, but he also learned fear. That's why he let her go in 1994. He thought the ghost of Tillman was still watching. By March 30th, the press had the story. Missing girl from 1986 found alive. Accomplice arrested after nearly 40 years. Reporters swarmed Burke County, cameras filling the courthouse steps. Margaret shielded Lucy from the frenzy, keeping her close, while Lane and Elise answered carefully at the podium. "This case is ongoing," Lane said. "We have one man in custody and proof of another who did not survive. But there are still questions about what happened in those years, and we intend to answer them." Elise stood behind her, silent, watching the sky break into pale gold, as if the mountains themselves were relieved to hear truth spoken aloud. That night, Elise drove alone back to Burnt Hollow. The cabin was long gone, only the chimney standing like a headstone. She walked the ridge, boots sinking into damp earth, and thought of Jim Halbrook, writing by flashlight in that cellar. Thought of Lucy whispering goodbye into a cassette that somehow survived fire and decades. She thought of Margaret, steady even when the world bent against her, and of Parsons, a man who believed he could vanish inside routine until routine itself betrayed him. She stood at the hearth and laid her hand on the stone. "We found her," she whispered. "We found him too." The wind stirred, carrying pine and rain, and in that moment Elise believed that Jim's words, "I tried," had finally reached their home. Story did not end in fire this time. It ended in survival. In a woman with a scarred past rediscovered in her 40s. In a mother who never stopped searching. In a ranger who refused to stop digging. Parsons would face trial. Tillman was a ghost with no grave. But Lucy was alive, and that truth was louder than any silence. As Elise turned back toward her truck, lightning split the ridge behind her, and the mountains held their breath as though even they knew. Some secrets, no matter how deep they are buried, cannot stay hidden forever.